It's really, really wonderful to be here. I first want to start by talking about who are Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And there is a lot out there when it comes to people's perceptions about youth and young people. I have to confess, I'm not a Gen Alpha. I'm barely a Gen Z. I'm a Zillennial, so I'm the cusp between Gen Z and Millennial. So I'll provide my own thoughts, but I'm sure many of you have your own perceptions as well. We see that Gen Alpha and Gen Z together constitute about 30% of the Australian population. So that's about 7.6 million Australians. But we also know that, like with any group, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they're not homogenous. They're incredibly diverse and also comprise of a range of intersectional groups as well. That includes in terms of race, in terms of religion as well. When it comes to race, as we know, Australia is a highly multicultural country. In 2019, around a quarter of young people in Australia between 15 to 24 were born overseas. And those top countries of birth were India and China. Also as well, we're increasingly seeing religious diversity, where younger Australians are less likely to be affiliated with Christianity, but might not have a religion or come from non-Christian backgrounds as well. But not only is there that diversity when it comes to perspective in terms of faith, in terms of personal traits, but also that translates when it comes to tolerance or increased respect for diversity as well. In particular, we see that young people, based on one survey done at ANU in 2019, 91% of young people had tolerance for people of different faiths across Australia. And also as well, 82% of young people supported marriage equality as well. But we can't take this for granted when it comes to diversity and tolerance of youth populations. As we know, a number of significant challenges that we've heard over the 2 days of this conference that really impact the experience of young people, whether it's through these trends like climate change, social polarization, online threats as well. And in particular, we see that polarization in the online domain is one of these key threats really impacting young people. So for those of you who attended the conference dinner last night, I think the Honourable Tony Burke already really highlighted this really, really well, around the fact that young people increasingly are becoming radicalised online, where especially with this under 16 social media ban, even though that's aimed at trying to protect young people online, the fact is it might actually cause young people to go to alt-right platforms or under-regulated platforms, such as Telegram, such as Gab, where there is more likely to be violent and really racist and sexist sentiments. And young people really try and create that sense of community by seeking it in the wrong places. But also as well, we see, as Burke mentioned last night, around online gaming, some of these areas which people might not have thought of as before, but being a significant factor when it comes to radicalising and influencing young people's perceptions. And the ASIO caseload, now 10 to 14-year-olds are increasingly becoming radicalised and being referred to these services as well. Also as well, we see that when it comes to youth inclusion in national security, the fact that while there is increasingly inclusion, we also see there might be selective ways of inclusion, or inclusion in a way that might be tokenistic. So, for example, I'm talking about the climate space. So when it comes to climate change, lots of young people involved in protests, Futures for Friday movement, also the fact that with Australia being the head of negotiations for COP31 this year, the fact that there's also going to be a youth climate champion who accompanies the Australian delegation to Turkey as well. But the reality is that despite this advocacy, we see the fact that 9% of Australia's energy consumption still continues to be derived from fossil fuels as well. So when it comes to these challenges, as Laura highlighted, climate change is one of these key national security issues that young people really resonate with and want to see tangible change with, but something that isn't necessarily being prioritised when it comes to the Australian government response, and probably due to this lack of youth engagement meaningfully when it comes to these decision-making spaces. So I'll leave it there. Also be participating later in the scenario exercise and also panel discussion. So looking forward to your insights. Thank you.
This year, I took a leap in my career. And I say leap not because it was poorly planned or spontaneous, but because it was uncertain. This year, I returned to university to become a high school teacher. Now, it's a certain career change, but don't be too surprised. I am technically, a bit like Afeeya, although reluctantly often, a member of Generation Z. And people of my generation are expected to have up to 17 different careers and 7 career changes over the course of our working lives. Which tells you something important. Gen Z and Generation Alpha are already adapting to a very different time. The question we've been asked today is, how will Gen Z and Generation Alpha shape the future of security? And I love this question because it doesn't ask whether we will shape the future of security, but it acknowledges that we inevitably will. For some of you, that might be a terrifying thought. And in fairness, there is research to back you up. Lowy polling from last year shows younger Australians are less convinced that democracy is always the best system. And research from the McKinnon Foundation in 2024 also found younger Australians are more open to violent, confrontational and disruptive forms of political action. So yes, if you stop there, it can sound worrying. And to worry you even further, as Afeeya pointed out, we, Gen Z and Generation Alpha, are already shaping the future. Millennials and Gen Z outnumbered baby boomers in the last election in every federal state and territory. And the first of Generation Alpha will be voting in our next federal election. We're coming. But then again, that's only half the story. And if you stop there, it can be frightening, although I do think there are some good reasons to have a bit of hope. And so I'm going to address 3 of them today. First, Generation Z and Generation Alpha are the most digitally capable generations Australia has ever had. The Australian Digital Inclusion Index shows that Australians aged 18 to 34 have the highest digital ability of any cohort. And that matters because our future is increasingly digital. Cyber threats, misinformation, AI, these are not fringe issues. They're central to national resilience. I'm very analogue with my paper, despite talking about digital. Yes, it's true that platforms like Instagram and TikTok are major news sources for Australia's young people, but it's also true that younger Australians are often the most fluent in navigating these environments, identifying scams, recognising AI-manipulated content, and adapting quickly to new technology. With the right tools and education, that fluency can be a strategic asset, not a vulnerability. Second, we are climate security realists. The Australian Defence Strategic Review made it unambiguous. Climate change is a national security threat. We know that it will have implications for regional instability, as well as our humanitarian assistance and disaster relief response. For younger Australians, this is well known. We have lived experience in this domain. Many of us have experienced once-in-a-lifetime natural disasters twice in our shorter lifetimes. And we know that unlike our senior peers, we are locked into this changed climate for the longer haul. Climate change consistently ranks in polling as the top concerns of young Australians. You saw that in the community consultations report, that climate change was the highest concern among younger people. But perhaps more importantly, the realism about the threat and the reality of climate change means there's a greater willingness to act. And polling has shown that young people appear more willing to act even when it comes at a personal and economic cost. And that matters because the hardest security decisions are often the ones where the benefits are invisible, the ones where you invest today to prevent something that might never happen tomorrow. That requires political and social licence, and Gen Z and Generation Alpha are the most willing to provide it on climate change. Third, and something that resonates most with me, younger generations think differently about what security actually means. Security is no longer about bombs and rockets. It's not about the military. It's not about borders. The NSC report makes this abundantly clear. It's about things like trust, social cohesion, whether our institutions are fair, inclusive, and legitimate. It is about the number one finding, peaceful and safe communities. Younger Australians, in particular, place a strong emphasis on these things, on inclusion, on well-being, on equity. They're not just abstract ideals, they are the foundation for a stable society. They're also the first generation brought up with widespread social and emotional learning and education. I know this from my teacher training. These Australian students today are receiving some of the most well-considered, well-researched, embedded training in social and emotional learning. They're given the language and the tools to understand themselves, their emotions, their peers, different members in their communities, and to develop things like resilience and like empathy. And this matters for our future leadership because leaders who understand people and can manage themselves are the kind of leaders who can help navigate us through crises, can help us navigate through complexity, build good teams, and build trust. These qualities are only more important as Australia sees itself in an increasingly complex geostrategic environment. Now, I want to finish with a bit of a home truth. In honesty, I'm practicing some teachable moments. So you'll notice, and you might have wondered why there's an image of a relay race behind me. And teachers love a cliche, and they also love a visual image. So here is yours. Ultimately, the way Gen Z and Generation Alpha and every generation that follows will shape the future of national security will depend on what is set up or left behind by the generations that come before them. The future will be shaped by what we choose to pass on. It comes back to where I started. My future is already adapting to the world I've inherited. new economic conditions and labour markets prompting more career changes and more uncertainty in my generation than in previous generations. But it's not just the economy we'll inherit. We'll inherit the tone of our public debate, the depth of our political divides, and the standards of leadership we choose to accept. We will inherit the moments of courage and the moments where we decided to defer, to kick the can, to look away. We can choose to hope that future generations will fix what will inevitably become past mistakes, or we can take responsibility now for setting the conditions that make resilience, security, and legitimacy possible in the first place. For me, one way to contribute to that is through education, by equipping young people to think critically, to navigate complexity, and to engage with the world around them. So I'll leave you with this. If the future of Australia's security depends in part on what we choose to pass on, what are you going to pass on? Thank you.
I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Before I go into my speech, I just need to give you some positionality of who I am and why I'm going to be speaking on this topic. So normally I speak about social cohesion, intergenerational equality, but today I'm going to be going back to my national security degree and the topic of influence and what I focused on at the NSC, and that's looking at centering First Nations perspectives, ways of knowing, being and doing across the Pacific, in Australia and also internationally. Now, why did I focus on that? And what does this have to do with Generation Z and Generation Alpha? Well, I do this because I'm a Goan woman. I'm a settler Australian, born and raised on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, but my ancestors, my tribal group, is from Goa, India. We have had connections to our lands, seas and skies since thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And growing up in Australia on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, I grew up during the Canberra bushfires. My family have deep connections to Marysville in Victoria. So only a couple of years later the town just completely wiped out and my family had to leave. Connection to country, both for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also Indigenous peoples all around the world, and the protection of climate is intrinsic to who we are as Indigenous peoples. It's connection to our ancestors, but also to future generations. Now, why is this important and how is this related to the next generations? Well, 73% of young people, as the NSC report says, came out with climate change as one of the top priorities for the next generations as a form of security threat. Now, when you're looking at national security, but when I was doing the NSC, I focused on human security. That is really important because national security is not just about traditional hardlines, but really it's looking at social connection, community. How do we take care of the environment? What are the threats that young people and communities are facing? And 83% of young people who were surveyed globally in 2023 said that they actually have climate anxiety. And so how does this go to First Nations and First Peoples? Well, there's a growing movement of young people, and we've been seeing this for the past 20 years or so, that climate change is encouraging us to think, and next generations to think differently. One of the growing movements that we're seeing is the support for legal environmental personhood. Does anyone know what that is? Has anyone heard of that concept? Okay. Basically, environmental personhood is a growing movement where we're having traditional owners and Indigenous peoples actually apply to the courts for legal rights and personhood status of traditional waterways, environments. This is really important because when we're discussing about the future of national security responses when it comes to natural disasters, it's no longer just about our current national security framework, which is the preservation of life, critical infrastructure, and then the environment. But really, it's rethinking how we prioritize our natural environment, and also how do we look and centre Indigenous ways of connection and the importance of country. During a national disaster, you often have sacred sites are at risk. When you have disconnection from accessing cultural heritage sites of traditional food sources, this is a problem because not only do you face the initial disaster, you have the cascading effects. One disaster to us, maybe we lose our homes, temporarily, but we can rebuild. But what happens if those sites are completely, irrevocably destroyed? You have a cascading intergenerational effect. That is something that we need to start considering when it comes to the future of national security responses. And we're seeing young people more than ever recognise this reality and recognising the rights of Indigenous peoples. And this is something that the Australian government is also starting to take into consideration when it comes to our disaster responses, in particular through the Sendai framework, which is looking at centering the rights and ways of knowing, being and doing of Indigenous peoples and legal personhoods within disaster responses. For young people, the protection of climate, the protection of First Nations rights is going to be a core centre of how they view our security responses. Generation Z and Generation Alpha are the most digitally literate generation ever. They're also growing up in a time of great truth-telling. So while thinking about Indigenous rights, climate rights, legal environmental personhood, maybe an add-on or it's too hard basket, this is actually something that young people are considering as more important. And so when we're looking at disaster responses in the future, we will have to balance all of these competing priorities. This will be costly. This will be incredibly difficult and challenging when it comes to engaging and centering First Nations rights, but it's also critically important to young people and to future generations. And that's what we're seeing, and that's the response that we saw, especially after The Voice, when we went out as the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition and we met and reconnected with Gen Alpha, those who could not vote in the referendum. And we asked them, if you had the opportunity to vote in the Constitution, if you had the opportunity to learn from First Peoples of Australia, if you had the opportunity to centre their cultural knowledge and learn and engage, would you do it? 93% said yes. So we need to take that into consideration. Thank you.